From Hope to Hostile Territory, the Cabrini-Green story. Cabrini-Green, a vision for stability in Chicago. Cabrini-Green began as a bold experiment in public housing. The early row houses, framed by green courtyards and red brick, offered families dignity and relief from overcrowded slums. Post-war optimism pushed the project forward, aiming to showcase what government-supported housing could look like when thoughtfully designed. At first, it seemed like a model for urban renewal, but even in these hopeful beginnings, questions loomed. Was the city truly invested in these communities, or simply removing an eyesore? As we look back, the initial vision stands in stark contrast to what followed, raising the question, was stability ever truly the goal? Francis Cabrini Homes, 1942, a national effort to house the poor. Completed in 1942, the Francis Cabrini Homes were part of a national initiative to address urban slums during wartime. These red brick row houses were modest but clean, built with open space and courtyards to promote healthy living. The goal was to uplift working-class families through better housing and a renewed sense of place. Though open to all races, segregation still shaped the tenant makeup. As time passed, maintenance waned and expansion plans, such as the Cabrini-Green high-rises, introduced new complications. What began as an ambitious federal investment in public good slowly became a local burden without sustained support. Urban renewal or social displacement. Urban renewal, once sold as a promise of modernization, too often meant the erasure of low-income communities. In Chicago, land around Cabrini-Green became highly desirable, making its residents targets for displacement. Entire neighborhoods were bulldozed to make room for highways and upscale projects. Promises to residents were rarely honored. The physical destruction mirrored social rupture. Families were uprooted with nowhere to go. This marks the turning point in the story, when redevelopment became a euphemism for removal. It raises a crucial question. Was renewal ever truly about the people, or just the property beneath their feet? The Housing Act of 1949. Revitalization or removal. The Housing Act of 1949 aimed to eliminate slums and spur citywide growth, but its consequences were devastating for many urban communities. Cities like Chicago used federal funds to demolish blighted neighborhoods, usually areas where poor and minority families lived. In theory, better housing would replace them. In practice, what came next were high-rise towers, limited social services, and continued segregation. The act didn't solve poverty, it reshaped where poverty lived. For Cabrini-Green, the legislation marked a moment when national policy intersected with local ambition, often without the input of those most affected. Stacked isolation, the rise of the high-rises. In the 1960s, Cabrini-Green expanded with towering high-rises meant to house thousands of residents in one dense cluster. But these buildings lacked infrastructure and support needed to function. Elevators broke constantly, hallways went unlit, and stairwells became dangerous. Overcrowding and underfunding created spaces where isolation replaced community. These weren't homes, they were vertical warehouses for the poor. The city treated these towers as a solution, but they quickly became symbols of abandonment. Instead of building neighborhoods, the high-rises stacked struggle on top of itself, one floor at a time. From community to crisis, the role of crime and gangs. With minimal city investment and shrinking opportunities, gangs emerged in Cabrini-Green to fill the void left by absent institutions. By the late 1970s and 80s, violence escalated not because residents were inherently dangerous, but because support systems had vanished. Youth turned to gangs for protection, income, and belonging. Meanwhile, political leaders distanced themselves and the stigma grew. What was once called a community was now labeled a war zone. This crisis didn't emerge overnight, it was a long-term outcome of systemic abandonment and structural neglect, turning neighborhoods into headlines and families into cautionary tales. The fallout of a broken system. As Cabrini-Green's conditions worsened, the blame shifted unfairly to its residents. Broken heaters, pest infestations, and lack of garbage collection weren't the fault of the residents. They were the result of chronic neglect. Still, media and city officials portrayed the community as failing. The system that created these conditions was invisible in public conversations. Residents, meanwhile, continued to live, work, and care for one another in an environment that grew increasingly unlivable. This unveiled how the so-called broken system didn't fail by accident, it failed by design. Media portrayal ignored the voices within. News coverage of Cabrini-Green often centered on crime, painting the area as cautionary and a home of urban decay. Helicopters hovered during shootouts, but never during community cookouts. Media ignored the mothers forming safety patrols, the teachers mentoring kids after school, and the residents leading food drives. Their stories were real, but rarely seen. This selective attention turned Cabrini-Green into a stereotype, but inside the walls it was more complex. Resilient, organized, and defiant. The failure to report those truths contributed to public misunderstanding and shaped a legacy that continues to overshadow the facts. Law enforcement and the escalation of tension. By the 1990s, law enforcement treated Cabrini-Green less like a neighborhood and more like a battlefield. Tactical raids became common. Curfews were enforced aggressively. Buildings were surrounded as if under siege. Residents, including children, were subjected to invasive searches. The policing tactics didn't build trust, they deepened fear. For many, flashing lights became a regular part of life. The violence that police were sent to stop was often inflamed by their very presence. This era wasn't just marked by gang activity, it was marked by the breakdown of any relationship between residents and those meant to protect them. Police, not protected. Residents of Cabrini-Green needed safety, but what they received instead was surveillance. Barbed wire surrounded buildings. Identification was required to move freely in and out. Cameras were installed not to ensure well-being, but to monitor and control. These strategies made residents feel like prisoners in their own homes. While officials claimed these efforts were for protection, the community understood differently. They were being contained, not cared for. Over time, the gulf between those in power and those impacted by their decisions grew wider, leaving behind a neighborhood that no longer felt like a home. Broken promises. By the early 2000s, the city began tearing down the Cabrini-Green towers, replacing it with mixed-income housing and upscale development. Officials promised former residents that they would be able to return, but most never did. Fewer than 20% came back, the rest were relocated to unfamiliar neighborhoods, often without the services they once relied on. For many, demolition meant not just the loss of housing, but the loss of community, identity, and support. The promises of revitalization remained mostly on paper. In reality, the erasure of Cabrini-Green erased more than buildings, it erased lives. Cabrini-Green, a warning for cities nationwide. Cabrini-Green is more than a story about a housing project. It's a lesson for cities across the country. When we treat public housing as temporary, underfunded, or disposable, we fail those who depend on it. The displacement, neglect, and media distortion that occurred here are not unique. They're part of a national pattern. Cities from New York to Los Angeles face similar issues. If we're serious about justice, equity, and rebuilding trust, we must look back honestly. Cabrini-Green warns us what happens when we build without care, and what's at stake when we forget who we build for.